Hello, everybody who's just joining. We're going to take a couple of minutes for just letting people get settled and join in, and we will get started in a couple of minutes. For those of you who may be joining, we're just taking a couple of minutes to get settled and allow people to transition from wherever they're coming from, and we will get started in a couple of minutes. Thank you, everybody, for joining. We're just allowing a minute or two for those who are transitioning from other places, maybe other virtual meetings, to join and get settled, and we will get started very shortly. Well, I think we'll let individuals slowly join us, and we will get started now. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to today's report launch and webinar discussion on the labor demand trends during the COVID-19 pandemic, analysis of online job postings in Canada. I would first like to acknowledge that the work we do takes place on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, which is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Our regional hubs and partners across Canada similarly gather on the traditional territory of many of Canada's Indigenous nations who have cared for these lands since time immemorial. My name is Julia Rem-Shepherd from the Future Skills Center, and we are housed at Ryerson University, and I am the Director of Strategic Communications. For those of you who are joining for the first time and may not know what the Future Skills Center is about, we're essentially a forward-looking organization that prototypes, tests, measures new and innovative approaches to skills development and training. As a pan-Canadian initiative, we're looking to connect ideas and innovations across Canada so that employers and employees can succeed in the labor market. Joining me today are some very smart people. I am your mere humble host here, and so I'll introduce a few of my guests. Austin Rax, Director of Research and Implementation at Magnet. Sosina Bezou, the Senior Research Associate at Diversity Institute. Strak Ivanov, the Founder and President at Vicinity Jobs. Tony Bonin, the Director of Research, Data, and Analytics at the Labor Market Information Council. And many of you may be expecting Wendy Sukier, who is the founder and director of the Diversity Institute. Unfortunately, she is not feeling well and so was not able to join us. But thankfully, we have someone who's been nimble on his feet. And so Michael Urban, the acting director of Research and Special Projects, has joined us and is filling her spot. The Diversity Institute is the research lead for the Future Skills Center. And today we will be sharing the first report in the Diversity Institute's Labor Market Insights series, published in partnership with Ryerson's Diversity Institute, naturally, Future Skills Center, Magnet, and Vicinity Jobs. This is a report based on an analysis of online job postings in the pre-pandemic and pandemic periods. And today's event also introduces a new series from the Diversity Institute that looks to provide timely analysis on current patterns of labor demand across Canadian regions, industries, and occupations. In the rapidly changing world of work, we know that many job seekers, policymakers, educators, and other stakeholders require labor market information that is up-to-date, granular, and relevant. And this need has become even more critical during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is essentially the largest shock in recent history for us, and particularly the labor market. After we hear about some of the key report's findings, a panel discussion will take place to delve into the trends and patterns of labor demand across Canada during the pandemic. So right now, we'll first hear from Sosina Bezou, Senior Research Associate with the Diversity Institute on the Future Skills team and report author. So please join me in welcoming Sosina. Over to you, Sosina.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Julia. I'm very excited about this launch, and I'm very pleased to provide some of the key findings of this report or this research. I'll start out by providing the agenda to take us through the outline of my talk. Next slide. Okay. So first, I'll briefly introduce labor market information sources, the different types of labor market information sources in Canada. I'll then present some highlights from the report, particularly focusing on the labor demand trends during the pandemic. I'll then say a few words about the implication of the pandemic for skills, and I will conclude by highlighting the labor market information needs for these unusual times. So there are several sources of labor market information in Canada, but I'll focus on the two main survey-based data sources. These are the Labor Force Survey and the census. So the Labor Force Survey is collected every month, and it is the main source of employment and unemployment estimates for Canada. It is frequent and timely, but it is less granular than the census. The census is collected every 5 years, but it has a high level of granularity and a lot of information at smaller local levels. So these are the two main survey-based data sources. If we look at the data from the Labor Force Survey, we can categorize and analyze the data by province and territories. We can categorize by sector. We can have an economic region level or census metropolitan level data. We can also disaggregate for different age groups and sex. On the other hand, with the census, we can go much deeper in terms of local level information. We can do analysis at the census division level. And the census also provide socio-demographic data, such as immigrant status, skills, education, and occupation. So with the census, we'll be able to do more detailed analysis for different analysis for labor market outcome of different groups. There are also other surveys and administrative data that are being used to supplement this survey-based data. Actually, the Labor Market Information Council has produced a report this year that that compares and shows a different source of data. And I really recommend referring to this paper if you want to understand more about the different type of data used in labor market information. And I think one of my colleagues will be posting it in the channel. So this report is based on a different type of data. Our report is based on analysis of data from online job postings across Canada. As most of you know, increasingly a large share of vacancies are now filled through online job posting, which means this is becoming a more important source of labor market information. The data we use for this paper is collated, cleaned, and organized by the Vicinity Jobs. And we really would like to thank Vicinity Jobs for providing us access to this data, and a magnet for facilitating this access. This data has many advantages, and we have also some concerns. In the next slide, we'll discuss both the strengths and potential limitations of this data. So the first advantage of this data is it provides frequent and timely data. So it is as close as we can come to near real-time data. So Vicinity Jobs collected the data collects the data every day, and the analytics is updated every week. So this is really very frequent and very timely data. The second advantage is that the information is granular. So the data we collect from the Vicinity Jobs includes education, skills, the education and skills requirements, knowledge requirements, the occupation classification up to 6 digits, as well as industry. And also it has more local data. That means we'll be able to analyze labor market information at a smaller geographic areas. As I said earlier, for labor force surveys, for example, you can do analysis at a metropolitan level or economic region level, but with this data you can do it at a city, for cities and towns. So these are very strong advantages. We can also say that this data provide a better indicator of in-demand skills and in-demand knowledge, as well as growing occupations, because we are looking into what employers are looking for instead of what kind of employees they have, which is what we'll find from the labor force surveys as well as from the census. So in that sense, it can provide very forward-looking information in terms of the skills in demand. But like I said, there are some limitations to this data, and there are some concerns. For example, the jobs that are jobs that are filled through internal vacancies or through word of mouth are not captured in this data. And jobs also may not be always, although I indicated that identifying occupation and industry is a strength, it's not always the case that each of the jobs are matched with their occupation or industry level. In fact, in analyzing this data, I found that a significant number of jobs were not matched with their occupation. So this may improve with improved in AI technologies that is being used for scrapping this data. But if it doesn't and the gaps are systematic, that could be a concern. Labor Market Information Council has recently released a report which analyzes how representative online job postings are. So they find that, for example, high-skilled occupations are likely to be overrepresented. They find that vacancies in agriculture and construction are underrepresented. So this is to say that in general, we have to consider this limitation in interpreting the data. But this is, like I said, the supportive or additional information. I now move to the main highlight from the report. The data we analyzed in this report cover from February to March, and like I said, we wanted to see how the pandemic affected labor market demand. As you can see, the bottom graph, the bottom line or graph is represents job posting in 2020, and the top one 2019. It's not a surprise that there is a gap, and the job posting in 2019 is of course much higher than the job postings in 2020. In fact, in those years from February to September, there were 600,000 fewer jobs in 2020 compared to the same period in 2019. And as you can see, job posting is how the job posting or the hiring demand has recovered after the summer and gets closer to the pre-pandemic period, which we consider here to be the 2019 period. So in September, the gap is only 7%. Next. So this graph shows the trend in early pandemic period, disaggregated for all of the provinces. So as you can see, all of the provinces have been affected by the pandemic, and job postings in 2020 was lower for all provinces in Canada. But there are differences. For example, if we look at only just the magnitude or the number of job postings, that has, the comparison of how many job postings there were in 2019, 2020, in pure magnitude, Ontario seems to be affected the most. There were more than 125,000 fewer jobs in 2020 compared to the same period in 2019. But if we take proportionally, Manitoba seems to be affected the most, where we see that job posting or hiring demand in 2020 was 53% lower than the job posting in 2019. For Canada, on average, in this period, it was 40% less. Similarly, there seems to be a glitch, but similarly, we see that job posting has declined in all sectors and occupations, but there is some difference. For example, in terms of sectors, we see that the retail trade, professional, scientific, and technical services, healthcare, and social assistance are the sectors that were the most affected by the pandemic. That means they have shown a much lower job posting in 2020 compared to 2019. But having said that, even within the same industry, the same sector, different industries respond differently. For example, if we take the retail trade, we find that, for example, clothing and clothing accessories stores, the job posting for clothing and clothing accessory stores has declined by almost 80%, while job posting for food and beverage stores has not changed. In fact, it has increased slightly. I guess we all remember our many trips to the grocery stores for accumulating a lot of tomato paste. So not every industry, even within the same sector, is affected in the same way, but overall, retail trade, professional, scientific, and technical services, and healthcare were the most affected. Within occupations, the most affected occupations are sales and service occupation, business, finance, and administrative occupations, and management occupations. So we thought that the pandemic was going away around September. So when the infection increases, when the economy starts opening up, labor demand also recovered around September. So in June to September, we define it as early recovery period. We see that job posting has improved during that period compared to, for example, the early pandemic periods. And by September, the job posting level reached 93% of the level in 2019. But again, similar to the case when they were affected, the recovery was also not the same across sectors. For example, the wholesale trade and retail trade sector has recovered faster than real estate and rental and leasing sector, which is having facing still a lot of difficulties, and the job postings are still much lower than they were in 2019. But I have to say here that the recovery is likely to be, I mean, even if we talked about early recovery here, this is going to be negatively affected by the recent spike in the COVID infection and associated public health measures that are being implemented across provinces. So in this report, we also tried to see if the pandemic affected skills demand. What we find is that broadly, the top skills remained the same. For example, at least 1/3 of job postings mentioned communication skills, teamwork, and customer service. But we also identified that there are new skills that are emerging, or skills that were existing but did not have much demand before are getting more mention in the vacancies. For example, vacancies that mention the use of surgical mask, face shield, etc., increased from a mention of 44 in 2019 to more than 2,000 in 2020. Again, also skills related to asset management software, human resource management software, etc. These have also increased, and we believe that this is related to, the skills that are needed for working from home. But these are still early days and early data, so we don't know if the trend holds. So what remains is we need to do more detailed analysis in order to identify the pandemic and post-pandemic skills that can be the pandemic and post-pandemic skills. For example, using this data, the job posting data from Vicinity Jobs, we can disaggregate the skills in demand by occupation, location, and industry. This will allow the job seekers, employment service providers, and others to focus on the skill gaps that's relevant to their geography, to their occupation, and to their industries, instead of working on a more general type of demanded skills. So now I want to say a few words about labor market information needs during these unusual times. So what we find in our analysis is that, of course, job posting across Canada has experienced a significant shock during the pandemic, especially during the lockdown. We see some recovery in June, September, but like I said earlier, this recovery is tenuous. In fact, although we have not analyzed it here in this report, an early peak to the data shows that in October and November, the gap in job posting has already started going up. So we have around -7% earlier, the gap between the September 2019 and September 2020. Now in October and November, it's more than 20%. So this is going, the hiring demand is going down again. Moreover, the pandemic is also changing the nature of work and the place of work. There is now more transition into teleworking and remote work. This, what we're doing right now, is an evidence. I'm talking from my home. So more people are teleworking and remote working, and this will have some implication on the skills in demand. We have also noticed that retail industry is shifting more towards e-commerce. This is a trend that has started earlier, but it's picking up because of the pandemic and the concerns that people have, both the buyers as well as the businesses who are struggling during the lockdown. Labor automation may also speed up due to the health concerns. So these are the things that show that the nature of work and the place of work is changing, or at least accelerating due to the pandemic. So all this implies that more than ever there is a need for a real-time and detailed labor market information. So that we are able to make informed decisions. So policymakers, job seekers, and and other stakeholders will need a very nimble, fast information. So data from online job posting is the one similar to the one we have used, can supplement official labor market statistics that's collected from surveys and administrative data. The aim of this report is to provide such timely information on labor market. This is the first of our reports in a series. Stay tuned, we'll have more reports to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sosina, for sharing this really important research. It's interesting to see even, the regional differences. And then also, since when you launched the report to where we are now, already it's showing different trends, right? Already we're going into a bit of a blip. You showed a bit of recovery and going down. So really important to kind of stay on top of that. Now I'm really looking forward to hearing the thoughts of our esteemed panelists, who can add further context to the report's findings and provide examples of how this research And the upcoming labor market series, which we have mentioned, can add value to some of the other labor market surveys and data. So I'm just going to introduce the panel now. You have heard from Sosina, excuse me, but I would like to just add a little bit more to her bio, as now she'll be sitting as a formal panelist. Sosina Bezu is an economist with a PhD from the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, who joined the Diversity Institute Future Skills team with extensive experience in research design and implementation, in quantitative research, behavioral experiment, and policy analysis. Her past research focused on international development with a focus on African and Asian countries, and covered topics like livelihoods, climate change, migration, youth, and women. Sosina is the author of the new Labor Market Insights series with Diversity Institute, which this is the first step. Tony Bonin is Director of Research, Data, and Analytics from the Labor Market Information Council. Tony leads LMIC's team of economists and data scientists. In this role, he collaborates with colleagues across governments, academia, and in the private sector to deliver high-quality labor market information. He brings extensive expertise in policy analysis, data analytics, econometrics, and research design. His previous research areas include stress test modeling, climate change, and macroeconomics. Strak Ivanov is the president, CEO, and founder of Vicinity Jobs. He's a Canadian technology entrepreneur, innovator, and a veteran of the online services and big data analytics industries. Under his leadership, Vicinity Jobs has grown from an untested startup idea, really, into one of Canada's most trusted providers of real-time labor market information. Strak holds a master's degree in business administration from Vienna University of Economics and Business Administration. And he wrote his master's thesis on the topic of using artificial intelligence to retrieve and classify information from online news sources. So a very natural fit. Austin Rax is the Director of Research and Implementation for Magnet at Ryerson University. He has worked with communities across Canada to craft economic and workforce development strategies, and regularly consults with officials at every level of government and various industries on approaches to recruitment and retention. He is a regular contributor to publications from the Labor Market Information Council of Canada, specializing in job scraping methodologies and findings. Michael Urban, as I mentioned, has stepped in Wendy's stead, and he is the acting director of research and special projects at the Diversity Institute. Previously, Michael was practice lead for government transformation at the Mowat Center at the University of Toronto, and has also worked as a returning officer for Elections Canada and with Global Affairs Canada, most recently as a Cadieux Léger Fellow. Michael holds degrees from the University of Oxford, the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University, and Queen's University. So after the panel, we'll have a few minutes to answer audience questions as well. So you might have some burning questions that you would like to have answered. So after the panel, feel free to enter them into the box, and we will do our best to address them at the end of the session. So over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Julia. We've got quite an impressive panel, so we're going to jump right into the next question, or into the first question rather, so that you get to hear from them instead of me. So the first question, which I'll address in the first instance to Tony, but then invite all the other panelists to join in on. Tony, Sosina briefly discussed some of the limitations of labor market data that's available. What are the limitations or differences in definitions of this data? And can you share some of your insights or findings from some of the papers that you've done at the LMIC that were mentioned? And then after that, we'll ask some of the other panelists to comment.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Sosina, for that excellent overview and presentation of the report. I think this is definitely the area that we're quite interested in, and an important piece that will be a subject of study for years, especially 2020, given its exceptionalness in terms of what's happened, and hopefully 2021 will be much nicer and better and smoother, let's hope. Yeah, generally speaking, on the limits of labor market information, primarily what we hear at the Labor Market Information Council all the time is people want data that is local and granular as possible. Can I get this specific job in this specific area in this town? And in terms of data availability, there are always going to be severe limits on that. There are sample size restrictions when it comes to surveys. Administrative data is going to have a limited number of observations and components and details around it. I think there's a lot more we can do with existing data sets and emerging new data sets. And I think the online job posting data that we've just had a great summary of is a good example of that. And in particular, as Cecina was saying at the end, merging this or connecting this to existing data like a labor force survey or census or so on, I think is incredibly important in how we can move forward. But no matter how far we get in that kind of area of merging and collecting data together, which is what LMIC is all about, inevitably there's going to be a limit to the data. And it needs to be filled and addressed with, I think, largely qualitative information, guidance, and advice given directly to individuals. As one brief example of this, a similar kind of, well, not to this, but a similar kind of report looking at LMI needs of different people in the, I think it's the Toronto area, focused on the limits that newly arrived immigrants to Canada were facing in terms of navigating the labor market. And one of the examples given in an interview was that for the realm of, I think it was psychology, you could find maybe some data on psychologist jobs, but not psychoanalysts. And psychoanalysts was what this individual was particularly interested in. And in her view, this was a much more important area and distinct from the other areas of psychology. About this, I take this person at her word, but I highly doubt that there will ever be robust, reliable data on psychoanalysts as like an area of work. That limitation will always be there, and that's okay if we understand and accept that, and then work with others who are engaged in that sort of qualitative, like career guidance side of things, and also, frankly, the personal side of things, people who are in a very specific field and can tell their story in their career pathway. And I think in terms of giving people the context by which to make more informed decisions is just as important, arguably even more important than the data itself. But I think the data is, of course, extremely important and will be going forward. Maybe I'll pause there. I have a lot more to say about the particular data related to online job postings, but I'm sure we'll come to that in a minute. So perhaps Austin, I know Magnet is doing a lot of work in that sort of area, working with individuals. So I think this is an important area that you guys have shown some leadership in.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. So I just came off another presentation from Stats Canada earlier this afternoon. It was with the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, and one of the statisticians from Stats Canada pointed out something really cool in the labor force survey, and they were seeing that, not surprisingly, every single economic region in Ontario suffered decline during the period we're talking about, right? COVID period, except for Muskoka, Kawartha. And I thought I was on this call and thinking, well, they have no idea why or what jobs. And here we are in this call with vicinity data. We can jump in and actually see during those periods what jobs were posted locally in Muskoka, Kawarthas that were not going on last year this time. And Stats Canada had no clue. Like, I asked the question, what are you looking at? And they're like, I'm not sure yet. So here we are, to Tony's point, this is all about connecting the dots between complementary data sources. None of them have all the can complete the entire puzzle for us, but it is about context and being able to kind of, okay, take it with a grain of salt, but then marrying up with some of the key questions we're trying to answer. In this case, timely, what's going on in this particular geography? Here we can answer it with Vicinity Jobs data. So I've got some other things to add a little bit later, but I'll stop on that one. Michael, I know that was only your first question here.
Great. Strack, was there anything you wanted to add from your perspective?
Yes. Well, first, thank you, Solcina, for the detailed analysis, and I'd like to thank everyone here for just the detailed review of the data and taking it to conclusions. That's exactly what we're hoping the data to be used for. I will say, I just would like to add that like any data source, like Tony said, ours has its limitations, and they result simply from the fact that we are primarily from the fact that we're using job postings as a proxy to analyzing the demand for labor. They're similar and they're linked, but they're not exactly the same thing. When employers have more difficulties finding the right fit for a position, they'll probably be more likely to advertise the job. When they have candidates in mind who they have come across before, or maybe even someone who they have laid off recently, they may not advertise the position, they may just recall them. So it's something to keep in mind. We're also limited by the fact that this is not a survey. It's an analysis of the footprint that employers leave online when they're recruiting. And what that means is we are limited to whatever the employers have chosen to publish in their job postings. It's not structured information. We don't have the opportunity to ask follow-up questions. There are gaps that we cannot necessarily fill. With that said, it's a large volume of data, and the analysis of this large volume of data on a very timely manner gives you a very timely picture of what's happening in the economy right now, what has been happening recently, that augments data from other sources that and produced using other methodologies. And that's exactly how it's intended to be used, as one of the data sources, not the single one.
So that's actually a really nice segue, Strak, into the next question that I wanted to pose directly to you around that timeliness that you just mentioned there. How important do you think it is to have real-time employment and job data, specifically as we're sort of dealing with this second wave of COVID-19 and hoping to enter the recovery phase as vaccines roll out?
Well, I would say one of the biggest questions on everyone's mind probably right now is what's next. We know that the economy has really been disrupted in ways that nobody probably expected or could have predicted a year or 2 years ago. So looking at this, people are asking the question, what happened? What has the impact been? And this is a great analysis that Sosina has put together, and I'm sure there will be more coming as more information becomes available. But we're also being asked, so what are the trends that you're seeing? And that's something that I hear actually personally quite often. And usually my answer is, at this point, I don't know. We're still in the middle of response. So the economy has been disrupted in many ways. So we know, for example, that online shopping has increased. We know that remote working has increased. What we don't know is to what extent these trends will remain, will persevere once. So what is the new normal going to look like? I think most observers agree that it's not going to be the old normal. There are going to be changes. This has been a huge shift. It has accelerated the adoption of technologies for sure, but we don't know how will businesses adapt, how will consumers adapt, and that's going to determine basically what changes within the labor market. People who are unemployed, or those who provide services to the people who are unemployed, need to understand this quickly. And reports that come, some of the reports that come will provide a lot of information, a lot of insight into this later down the path. But those who are looking for work cannot wait for 6 months to get that information. They need some of this insight now. Looking at the data, the job postings data, we'll be able to tell, that's where we're going to see the earliest evidence of how the situation is changing. How is the demand for skills? How is the demand for specific occupations changing as a result of the transition that we have gone through? how is probably the geographic distribution even of vacancies and advertised jobs changing. And I think it's important to get as much information as possible as early as possible, so that we can get so that we can help those people who have been affected the worst get back into the labor force, because we also know that the longer someone has spent outside of the labor force, the more difficult it gets for them to re-enter it and get reintegrated into it. So for that reason, I think that having real life labor market data is crucial to staying relevant and providing the assistance that's going to achieve that objective.
Great. Sosina, Tony, Austin. I see Austin's got his hand up. Do you want to say something about timeliness and its importance?
Yes, certainly. I would just want to piggyback on a couple of Strack comments there. First of all, just saying, I know Strack well, so I'm about to say don't take it too far. Strack's the only person, as an economist, is going to tell you, I don't know. Right? Most economists, sorry, Tony, we're going to say, yeah, we have this projection, this is where things going to happen. What's true during COVID is we've never seen anything like this before, right? The effects are very early, and we do know it's unevenly distributed by sector, by occupation. So to Strack's point, the best we can do is have the most timely information available. And one of the really cool things about this data set is when an employer posts a job, that is a concrete indication of their intention, right? When Stats Canada goes out and we're doing labor force survey work, like that's survey and that's projection. That's what's in that employer's head, what they're thinking they want to do. But of course, that's only as good as what's in their head at that time. So I really love having this like quasi leading indicator of what employers have actually put pen to paper, they're posting for a role. Now we don't know if the role is actually going to be filled, closed, hired. So that's definitely a caveat there. But I think it's far better than just asking employers, what do you think you're going to be doing in 3-6 months during COVID, where truly no one knows. So with that, I'll pause to say this is good stuff to be working with right now. Back to you, Michael.
Okay, great. I mean, that's you didn't quite call it a revealed preference, but that I feel like that's what an economist would call it there. Tony, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think Austin raises a very good point in terms of, maybe a bit of a jargon term, but leading indicator for sure. And I was thinking of that during Cecina's presentation as well, that in September, job postings had recovered more or less to 93%, I think it was, of their pre-pandemic level. At that point, employment had recovered roughly 3/4 or 75% of the jobs lost. So in thinking about that recovery rate, it was certainly, in retrospect, a bit of a leading indicator pointing in the direction of recovery that we've seen also in October and November. It's something Strack and I have discussed a little bit, this idea of trying to use job postings, and it makes sense logically as a leading indicator because you first have to try and recruit before you actually hire somebody. So the connection there makes a lot of logical sense. But given the nature of the data, the different web sources that you get, there's a fair bit of noisiness. So that makes a bit of a challenge of connecting it, posting data to more stable sources like the labor force survey, which is also actually quite noisy itself when you cut to like a sub-provincial level, for example. But yeah, I think there's a lot of promise there, but more work needs to be done in that area first.
Okay, great. Sosina, was there anything you wanted to add at this point, or should we move on to the next question?
I think most of the points are covered, but I just want to mention that the Statistics Canada has somewhat a similar survey of vacancies and wage, and they just released the first quarter of 2020 just today. So in a way, this kind of signal that, like Austin said, this could be taken as a leading indicator earlier, which could be supported and substantiated by the data coming from StatsCan.
Great, thank you. Okay, so next question is, I'll direct it at Tony in the first instance. Honing in on skills development and education, we see that definitions are inconsistent and categories differ when we're often talking about these sorts of things. So for example, there's an OECD review of skills, skills in demand, that cited digital skills as the most needed. So when this came out, education and training providers quickly pivoted and started pushing coding skills. But this may have been not directed in the right way, because when you actually unpacked the labor market data, the 75% of these digital skills that were in demand were actually skills for, Microsoft Word and Microsoft Excel skills. So how can we better address this issue of categorization, definition, classification of skills?
So thank you, Michael. This is one of my favorite hobby horses that I could go on for a while. So let me know if I've gone too far. But look, the starting point, honestly, is we're not always talking about skills. Microsoft Office, not a skill. Coding, arguably it's a skill, more of a task. But not to get overly pedantic, but I think it is important when we think about the type of data, especially that we get from online job postings, to think clearly about, okay, skill as an applied capacity to a task versus a tool or technology you need in the workplace versus a description of the workplace. Is it outdoors? Do you have to sit a lot at this particular job? Is it a very fast-paced setting? Is punctuality super important? All extremely relevant to people. It's not to say these non-skill categories are. This is why we've been referring to the broader categories work requirements. I think that's a starting point. It doesn't get you nearly to where you want to get to, because the world of work requirements and skills, taxonomies, and so on is varied. There are, the OECD was working with its own taxonomy. Vicinity Jobs has its own. Other web scraping firms that collect online job postings do the same. And then there are things like the ONET system in the United States and Employment and Social Development Canada's Skills and Competencies Taxonomy. Those last two, ONET and ESDCs, are of a very different nature entirely. There's a small set of skills, robustly defined, independent of one another, like exclusive categories, but at a very general level, like active listening or communication skills. Now, a few of those you might see in online job postings, but it can create confusion when you think about, when we talk here about skills, you Google it, and if you find ESDC's website, you'll see a list of, I think it's 47. If you find the ONET one, you'll find a list of 35. Similar, but enough difference in what you find out there that it can lead to confusion. I don't think we're ever going to get to a point where we have like one skill dictionary or taxonomy. And that's kind of okay, but as long as we're clear about what we're talking about and that there are these different types of categories of work requirements broadly that do matter to people, that's putting us a bit on the right track there. We have a few entries on a piece of our website called WorkWords, where we try and give some more concrete, one on skills, I think, which was published yesterday, if I'm not mistaken. And it goes through some of these issues and challenges and trying to talk about skills in particular in a coherent manner. And I think that's what we need to do now in order to eventually measure skills in a coherent, consistent manner. What Cecina's report does is look at measure skills in part based on Vicinity Jobs data. That's great and the point where we need to start, but doing this in a more robust and consistent way, like via, I don't know, Statistics Canada or via our own surveys or what have you, that's going to require us to be very careful with the language we use to organize the information that we collect via surveys, online job postings, and so on. So yeah, there's a danger of conflicting information going out there, a danger of people being confused as to what is a skill, what's not a skill, what they need to develop. And to put one last point on it, digital skills, I don't know what that means, frankly. Like, I really genuinely don't know what a digital skill is. I know people who code, I know people who use Microsoft Excel, and when you talk about categories of skills, I think that's where different taxonomies get really dangerous, because then one big broad group becomes a common phrase like digital skills, and others pick that up and might be using or defining or measuring that in a completely different way. I don't have a great solution other than continuing to collaborate and speak openly about this so we can get to a sort of more language here, but I think that's absolutely crucial for us to do that.
Okay, I'm going to go to Sosina first, and then Austin's got his hand up next.
I think this was an excellent discussion by Tony. I just want to add that Diversity Institute and Future Skills Center has produced a paper on competency framework, which goes into some of these issues of measurement of skills and competencies, the different kind of skills. So I recommend that people have a look at that. It's available on the Future Skills Center website. This is produced in collaboration with the PPF. When Tony mentioned digital skills, I just remember a statistics that I saw and StatCan. So as you know, a lot of Canadians have experience working with internet, 95% to be exact, but out of all Canadians, barely like 2/3 have never downloaded a document into their computer, for example. So this is a kind of, I don't know, again, we're debating the definition of skills, but it is a kind of digital skills, for example, that people don't have. So when we talk about digital skills, we shouldn't be jumping into the coding, which not everyone needs, but especially now with teleworking and home working, being able to download files into your computer, sharing files online, these are the kind of things that are needed at the basic level. Thanks.
I guess I'll pick it up. You know, I like Tony's honesty in his response here about, you know, what do we really know about skills and how we're defining them. I had a discussion with one of our audience members, Trudy Parsons. She's a thought leader in this space, and we were trying to figure out. I mean, there's quite a communication gap. That's kind of the way I think about this. The job seeker, the student, in our economic speak, the supply side, they have their own ways of thinking about what they bring to the table with respect to skills. An employer, they have their own way of thinking about what skills I'm trying to hire for. And then in the mix, we have career influencers or educators that are trying to impart these skills along the way. And to date, no one really has common definitions that everyone can point to and say, hey, that's what we're actually teaching towards, right? Or this is what I have. And of course, we have our consistent challenge of actually validating, right? So even if I went to college or university and I went to this program and I graduated, did I actually come away with this skill? So behind the scenes, we could be doing a lot of work to kind of infer the skills that people get through different educational pathways, but actually validate it. Did this actually come out the other end? This is really, really challenging. And so at Magnet, one of the things we're looking at is how do you allow somebody to kind of claim a skill, just like LinkedIn, right? You're thinking, okay, well, I've got this thing, I'm going to claim it. So, maybe I want some of my colleagues to say, yes, I'm good at this. Well, that's okay. But how does that truly stack up when you walk into a new workplace? And will that employer give the same kind of credibility, weight, the way you think about the skill versus another? So I think we're really scratching the surface on this one. And until we can get more common definitions, but truly what these skills mean day to day in a workplace setting, I think it's a lot of semantics, to be frank. So I'll leave it there. Back to you, Michael, on this one, or Strack.
Yeah, Strack, why don't you pick it up?
Yes. So when we talk about skills, when we're actually building our skills framework, and that is something that, as Tony says, that the Labor Market Information Council, to avoid confusion, refers to as work requirements. What we looked at is we looked at ONET, we looked at available frameworks that were out there, and we also looked at at job postings. What do employers actually call skills in their job postings? And we have done quite a bit of work looking through those under a microscope, including some just analysis that we did with Tony and his team maybe about a year ago, where we tried to actually match those work requirements to skills, to more standardized definitions of skills. So several things that stand out that we have learned through that exercise. One of them is that in the job postings, when employers advertise a requirement for skill, they don't necessarily list every single skill that that job is going to require. Rather, they seem to be more likely to list skills where they think that the job seekers or the candidates, that that the job candidates may not have. So things that are going to differentiate the job candidates when they're applying for them. So ones that will probably be in a shorter supply, the ones that are self-explanatory, because if you're applying for a job as an accountant, for example, you have to know math. They're not going to necessarily go out in the job posting. So that's something that's important to understand when you look at job postings. And the other thing that you have to understand when you look at data from job postings is that we go from a list of skills that we have identified that as possible, as potential skills, and we update that list periodically. But we may sometimes miss, for example, a skill that is new, and it may take us a little bit of time to add it. So it's fairly complete. We have a list of tens of thousands of skills, but there could be blind spots in it as well. Looking at a large volume of data has the advantage that, if a skill is being required in more job postings, it's probably more of a hot skill, one that is in demand, one that is more likely to probably get you through the door when you're applying for work. But at the same time, you have to remember that we're extracting those skills from the job postings. What we're not extracting is the importance. Is it a nice to have skill? Is it a must have skill? And that is something that we're not able to analyze, at least not quite yet. But the intensity, so how important is it to have this skill in order to actually get the job?
Great, thanks, Drek. We have 3 questions left, and we have just over 10 minutes to get through them. So I might ask that we keep our comments a little shorter, just so that we give the audience some time to ask questions. The next question I'm going to throw directly to Austin. Austin, how can labor market information help people make better decisions? Workers, employers, policymakers, whoever. Who is the end user, and what do they need to use this information effectively?
Yeah, I think it's a good question in that a lot of people don't know what's out there as it relates to labor market information. I routinely say there's a lot of good data out there. It's not in front of you when you need it, right? And that's, I think, the fundamental piece here is at Magnet anyway, kind of our mission and our end users are job seekers, employers, and what we call career influencers or employment intermediaries. So when you think about an employment service provider, a career counselor, you're at a job, you want to go in, you want to get help. That's someone that we work with. And so what we're trying to do, and we've got an active project right now with both Strack and Tony on this, so we're a good company, is trying to take the insights that we've got from relatively real-time labor market information from Strack's data set and inject this into the workflows of someone that's either looking for a job or posting a job. I'll just give you an example, right? If I'm a job seeker, I may not know, this is our last conversation, the types of skills that I should be referencing in my resume based on what that employer and that employer is looking for. But using this and kind of triangulating the data sets we have at our disposal, as well as what we know about other employers, what they do in this space, we can serve up to these job seekers at the point of application. Here's the skills you should be highlighting, right? Because this is going to be important for this employer based on what we know about others. Here's the relative wage information that we think, this is likely going to be asked for or provided for this role. And also the geography, right? Which employers are hiring and how many openings are there in particular locations, right? So we want to give this stuff at the point when it's actually could be useful. So for me, that actually is more important than marrying 100 different data sets. It really is just getting it in front of the right person at the right time. And I think one of the things this group at large we can work on is ensuring that we are taking the work that StatsCan is doing and making sure that it is injected in these different workflows. So I'm mindful of time, so I'll stop there, but that could open up some other discussions.
Great. Is there anyone else on the panel who wants to talk about the end users, whether it's workers, employers, policymakers, before we move on to the next question?
Only to quickly say, I think it is important to always be there to contextualize the information, as Austin was saying, and because the inevitable limits of the data, that will always be an important piece that I think needs to be strengthened across the country basically.
Great, thanks, Tony. Okay, we'll move right along to the next question then. Sosina, I'm going to throw this to you first off, and then maybe Strack and Tony might be interested in commenting as well. The top 10 job posting skills seem to be consistent during the pandemic compared to the same period in 2019, with some new emerging skills, the sort of becoming, I guess, more important, but the 10 top ones still being the same. Can you unpack some of these skills? For instance, it looks like communication skills is the top one at nearly 40%.
Yes, I think if we do a disaggregation of these skills, I mean, if you look at these skills up close, you will find that most of these skills, the top 10 skills, are related to the foundational or essential, the skills that are identified as essential skills or foundational skills by ESDC. For example, communication skill is related to oral communication skill, which is considered as a foundational skill. Teamwork is related to working with others. So this kind of underscores the importance of these essential skills in the Canadian workplace across the board. But if you go and disaggregate by occupation, for example, you'll find that the importance of specific skills may change, but most of these top skills are still included. If you take sales and service occupation, for example, you'll find that customer service is a top skill, not communication, at 54%. If you go to management occupation, communication is a top skill at 45%. So yes, all these the 10 skills are present across occupations, but the importance will vary by occupation. So I think it's helpful for job seekers and employment service providers to know what skills are in demand in their geography, in their industry, and in their occupation, just building on what Austin had been saying earlier.
Strack, do you want to add to that?
Yes, yeah, I want to just expand a little bit on the importance of looking at those skills or being able to look at those skills for specific occupations. Yes, the top 10 skills are the skills that, if not all of the jobs, then a lot of the jobs will require. And one of the reasons why they're coming up at the top is because they're universal, they're across the board, regardless of what occupation you're looking for. So it is important to work on them and to work on those skills and have them. But at the same time, it's very important to have data to be able to look at individual occupations and understand what can, if you're a job seeker, for example, what can differentiate you when if you're looking for an occupation in that particular field. And one of the advantages, I think, of data extracted from job postings is that even for fairly narrowly defined occupations, let's say, even if you look at the knock code, at the 4-digit knock in a given location, let's say in a city, you can have a fairly good sample size to analyze, and that will give you some pretty good idea or pretty good information of what the employers are looking for. You can even go down to the level of exactly who is looking for those, which employers, how does the demand vary between employers. That's some fairly valuable information when you're trying to operationalize it.
Anyone else want to add anything? Tony?
Just to add on to what Sosina was saying about the stable skills across the years. I mean, honestly, this is one of the most fascinating pieces of the report and the findings, right? That even though this is a source of data pulled from online job postings, lots of noisiness and issues in that respect, there's a certain stability to the skills data that I think is fascinating and shows that this is kind of a slow moving trend, but one that you can track over the long term. So in the coming months and years, I think this will be a great piece to continue to follow.
Great. Okay, well then we'll move on to our final question, and then we'll open it up for audience participation. I'll throw this one to Sosana to start with, and then if anyone else wants to jump in, please feel free. This question is not specific to this report per se, but we want to focus a little bit on inclusive employment and whether this report can speak to that at all. We know that the economic risks and impacts of the pandemic were not uniformly distributed among Canadians. Workers employed in industries where close physical contact is required and where working from home is less common or possible tended to be more likely to lose their jobs. Youth, women, recent immigrants were also more likely to be unemployed due to the economic shutdown, perhaps because they tend to be concentrated in these sorts of industries. How can a deeper analysis of the impacts on underrepresented populations support more inclusive employment?
Thanks. Yes, like you said, the labor market outcome for women, youth, immigrants, Black and other visible minorities has been worse, especially during the lockdown. And while there are, of course, many factors, the most important or the key factor would be that they are working in vulnerable occupations, as well as they are often in not all of them, but especially recent immigrants employed in temporary positions. So, their employment in these vulnerable occupations and in temporary positions is not necessarily related to their skill level or their education level. In fact, earlier this year, we have published a paper where we show that even in occupations where there is a skill shortage, for example, ICT, for example, women and immigrants are underrepresented. They are not being recruited. They are not being retained. So this has to do with some extent on recruitment and human resource management. So this is something that we need to highlight. But second, and especially moving forward, we have to make sure that especially with employment or at least the workplace moving more towards teleworking and remote work, we have to make sure that Canadians, significant share of Canadians are not left behind. For example, rural areas do not have good internet connection, which means they are unable to work from home, which means when there is health measures like this, where they need to stay home, they will not be working, they will be laid off. There is already evidence studies showing that people in high income groups are more likely to work. People with more education, especially the ones above a bachelor degree, are more likely to work from home as opposed to people who have less education. So this is going to have a lot of income inequality implications. So knowing who is affected by the pandemic and who's able to work in remote work and who's not, all of this information will be relevant in order to address policies and measures to the people who need them. For example, improving internet access, improving access to technology, improving the gaps or filling up the gap in digital skills. For example, there is a lot of gap in Indigenous communities when it comes to education level or digital skills. So this compounds the internet access gap. So these issues are gonna snowball. So identifying who's affected by the employment would help us design a better policy and programs, I think.
Great. Thanks, Osana. Does anyone else Tony, you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about the pandemic and following it quite closely all of this year has been what we've identified as labor market information gaps, some of which are new ones, some of which are just old ones that have reared their heads again, so to speak. Again, local granular data is one that comes to mind just as a general category, but a new one that I had never, it makes perfect sense in retrospect, but didn't seem as important until this year, is of course, access to childcare. And the idea that this has been a she session, I can never say that very well, but women have borne the brunt of this as well as other underrepresented groups, largely because they have shouldered the responsibility of taking care of children. And there's been lots of good analysis on this in terms of the impact of women with small children versus ones who have no children or children who are a bit older and can stay home by themselves. And prior to the recession and the pandemic, I wouldn't have thought of that as necessarily a part of the labor market information system, but now for sure it is. I think that is something we need to think about and integrate into the kind of data and insights that we see. And just a final point on that, there is of course a limit to what LMI can do for sure. It's just information. If the resources aren't there, if it's not an affordable resource for people to use to allow them to engage in the labor force, then the information is, you know, it might be as necessary, but it's certainly not a sufficient condition to make the economy more inclusive.
Great. And Austin, did you want to have a quick final comment?
You know, it's okay. Tony's last round was great. And I know we want to get to questions.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. All right, so that concludes all the program questions we have there. So I'm going to throw it back to Julia.
Thank you, panelists, and thank you, Michael. I am looking at the time here, and it looks like we might have maybe 15 or so minutes of a general Q&A. And so if you haven't already, feel free to go ahead and enter some Q&A questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we do actually have a couple already. We did encourage folks to feel free to ask questions along the way. And so I won't necessarily prescribe who can answer it. I mean, feel free, I'll just open it up and you can raise your hand and I'll just help moderate as best I can. So one of the questions is actually around digital literacy. So many of you spoke with sort of, you know, what are digital skills and what does that actually mean? Sort of an adjacent kind of question related to that is digital literacy is a huge area of concern. And so what do you view are the benchmarks of digital literacy? So I'd like to just open that up if anybody wants to take that on. Or maybe I'll tap somebody. Austin, go for it. Austin and then Strack.
I mean, this is a massive question.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, I don't know if the participant who asked me want to just like kind of narrow in a little bit. I'm sure there's kind of a root piece here, kind of what you're trying to get at. I think all the panelists would say digital literacy is such an umbrella term. I just want to kind of unpack, so to speak, exactly what you're driving at. I don't know if there's a follow-up option. Yeah.
At this point, I don't know actually if there is. I'm just looking at the sort of questions that are curated coming through the Q&A. But if the individual has asked if they want to kind of clarify through the Q&A, happy to bring that forward. To maybe if there's some context with it, because I think it kind of came through while there was that conversation about whether it's coding or whether it's you know, using Excel and Microsoft, that kind of thing. It kind of came through there. Strack, did you want to say something as well?
Yes, I was. What I wanted to comment here is that we have a whole in our taxonomy. One of the skills categories is actually technology or technologies, and we realize basically how many postings require the knowledge of specific technology. And fair enough, yes, Microsoft Office, Word, Excel, those are the ones that tend to come up at the top. Probably that's again related to the fact that they are required across many occupations. But that can give you a bit of an idea, at least even when you look at the level of specific occupations, and I would say probably should look at the level of occupations that are not specific to IT. If you're a programmer, you need to have certain skills that nobody else probably needs to have. But looking at this gives you an idea of what employers require in terms of the so-called digital skills, which I would say usually, in my experience, when people speak about those, they mean the ability to use certain technologies. So which technologies do employers actually want the candidates to be able to use?
Thank you. Maybe I'll go on to the next question. This is a question that is very, very timely and quite poignant. So the question is, what are the pandemic-proof skills? You know, we've talked about a few different things, and we've talked about communication, different things, but what are the pandemic-proof skills? For example, many are talking about increasing investments in the care economy. So you may have heard that. What do you see for the future when it comes to that from your areas? Tony?
Yeah, I can speak to this a little bit more with the lens of occupations, but occupations and skills are closely connected. I gave a presentation several weeks ago now, looking at forecasts from the federal government, the COPS forecast, pre-pandemic versus what's happened this year. And as you can imagine, way off, right? Nobody expects anybody to expect a 10-year forecast to capture something like this. So that's, fine, give them a pass. Forecasting is no easy job, especially in this. But the interesting thing was when you accepted that we're at a much lower level than what we were forecasting from in 2019, the largest and fastest growing jobs, in the forecast, so those predicted to grow the fastest over the next 10 years, broke down into basically 11 specific occupations that fell into 3 or 4 groups, exactly the groups you would expect, that have done relatively well this year as well, which is business services and IT. So this is a lot of like finance, management, middle management jobs, but in types of services between different firms and so on. IT skills for sure, software engineers, that kind of work. And then the other 2 categories were healthcare workers and education services. And for sure, I mean, in this pandemic, the need to have more people at schools to ensure social distancing has been hugely important, difficult to roll out, no doubt. And we have, of course, in every day focused more and more on healthcare and safety and caring for people, again, in a social distancing way. Now, the skills associated with those jobs, yeah, I mean, there's different ways to look at that. You can pull the data from online job postings from Vicinity, for example. You can connect those occupations to skills taxonomies, fixed ones like the US ONIT system or potentially the ESDC one, but you can have a guess sort of as to what's in there. And I find it very interesting that these jobs predicted to grow the fastest pre-pandemic are also ones that make sense that have done the best within the pandemic. Maybe that's very specific to this particular one. Hopefully we won't have another one for quite some time, but yeah, I think what we were thinking before in terms of safe or future-proof occupations and skills remains true today.
Thank you. I'm seeing a couple of mics off. Austin, did you want to take that? Strack, did you also want to weigh in? Austin,
yeah, I just had a quick comment. I think Tony's last piece there is important. I don't think so much of pandemic-proof skills. I think of those more of like future-proofing. And of course, the time scale is really important, I think, to this question, as well as where does this person want to work, right? If reframing the question a little bit, if I'm giving someone career advice and you wanted to get into a new career, retrain, okay, certainly what are you interested in? That's all fine and good, right? But truly, where do you want to work? And then comparing that against what employers are we seeing a slight resurgence, given government imperative to kind of reshore some of the things that we might have sent afar to other countries do for us. We're seeing increased emphasis on shoring up our own domestic supply chains, which is, we didn't see that pre-pandemic. But then the other piece is kind of probability of automation, right? That's just undercutting everything. And so I often, when I talked about people with this, I think about, can this task, not necessarily job, be automated? Like, is it so repetitive that at some point a machine is going to do it for us? And the occupations Tony was just describing, there's a lot of people-to-people interaction. That stuff is not easily going to be automated anytime soon. So I think those are safe places to put effort if you wanted to retrain. Hopefully that answers your question. And just while I'm on it, just one quick note. I saw a question from Peter. Peter, I'm more than happy to connect with you offline on your question. We do a lot of work with people with disabilities, so I think I'll ask the group here to send my email your way. Back to you, Julia.
Okay, and in fact, I was going to actually ask that question again, but Strack, I'm not sure if you wanted to weigh on this particular topic just now.
Yes, well, I'll just second the comment that Austin made, that the underlying trends, the demand is going to be driven by the underlying trends in the economy. So whether that's reshoring jobs that have been sent abroad before, automation, technology adoption. However, at the moment, we're still in the middle of the pandemic. And the picture that we're seeing at the moment is probably quite skewed because a lot of businesses seem to be still in somewhat of a survival mode, where so they have let people go. They may have rehired some of them, and we have seen a spike in the hiring demand for those. There are other jobs where there has been a drop in the hiring demand, and that has not recovered much. But if you look at the labor market data, the labor market survey, those have not declined, and that's because most likely those employers did not let those people let people in those occupations go, but they're also not looking to hire any new ones. That I expect that this will change as we move out of the pandemic, and employers start investing in building new product and addressing the new needs that are going to emerge from all this transformation in the economy. And that's why it's important to actually look at this data frequently, and have it in real time and see what's emerging. Where is this taking us? How are employers responding to what's happening now?
Thank you for answering that. I realize that we are just getting close to time, so I will raise this one last question. Again, going back to Austin, there was a question from Peter that I thought I was going to raise to the group, but I realized that could be taken offline, so that's fine. We'll definitely get back to you, Peter. So the one question for the group here, and there's others as well. So the team behind the scenes is, because we're tracking all the questions, and we'll try to get back to the group, whether it's through email or something, on some of the key things that kind of come through. One last question then before we wrap is related to the OECD's transversal skills. So how do OECD's transversal skills vision fit into all of this? At the time OECD released this a few years ago, it hadn't envisaged the pandemic, of course, but the future work was on everyone's radar. So this isn't a specific question, but interested to hear what the panelists think about that. And obviously there's something kind of a big question, but not unrelated to the OECD topic we touched on earlier. So I'll just open that up and see. So Sonia, would you like to speak to some of this?
Yeah, I can say a few words about that, and I will let the others chip in. So in general, some of the trends that have been identified by OECD in terms of the future of work is going to be accelerated, and some others could be decelerated or slowed down. For example, automation, it's possible that automation can actually be speeding up because of, manufacturers now will be concerned in bringing in too many workers in the same place, in addition to the feasibility of being able to replace repetitive manual works or tasks. So this may actually, the pandemic may actually end up speeding up the automation process. And the other issues, for example, the green economy, there may be a possibility that if policymakers are adopting measures to the recovery, so that the recovery is cognizant of the climate change, then there may be more job opportunities in the green economy. So that's also something that may be accelerated due to the pandemic. And but there are also other activities. For example, like Tony, I think Austin or Tony were mentioning how the reluctance of countries to rely on international supply chains because of the disruption in the pandemic. This may result in moving in some of the workers into the country. So that is going to be that's going to slow up maybe what was expected to increase before in terms of offshoring. So this is so some of the trends will be accelerated and some others will be slowed down. So we'll see.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we could probably go on all afternoon. There's so many good questions and great conversation here, and really good thoughts that are coming through the chat. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, and some of you might have been sitting this whole time. I don't know. You might stretch your legs, go get a glass of water, all of that. But anyway, really want to thank our panelists, Sosina, Austin, Tony, Strack, and our moderator, Michael. Your insight and experience are really invaluable. And I think even some of the conversation and comments coming through from those who are in the audience have been really important and food for us to continue to think about. I want to thank the Diversity Institute for their continual support for putting together this event, and also the support of Magnet and Vicinity Jobs for this report in the Labor Market Insights series. Everyone who registered for this event will be getting a copy of the report by email shortly. And for some of you who arrived a little bit later, the recording will also be made available. You can also follow the Diversity Institute on Twitter. That's at RyersonDI, or on LinkedIn, searching for the Diversity Institute. And the Future Skills Center as well, at FSC_CCF_EN. That's a mouthful, but essentially if you look up Future Skills Center, you'll be able to see our address there. So you can follow both to keep up with the latest news, events, and upcoming research reports. It is my pleasure to be with you today, moderating this session, and really thank you for this opportunity, and want to wish everybody a wonderful day with a few minutes to spare. So have a great afternoon, everyone.